Cheese butter is the delicious gourmet cheese melt that blends 4 indulgent cheeses and seasoned butter. I love this stuff. Perfect on bread, bagels, sandwiches, veggies, and more. You'll get 15% off at cheesebutter.com/Pacman. The link is down below. Let's start today with Joe Biden's first State of the Union address. Many of you wrote to me. You said, David, I remember in 2021, Joe Biden gave a State of the Union address. Yes, he basically did, except in a president's first year in office, that first joint address to the House and Senate is not called a State of the Union address. So this was the first State of the Union address by name, but the second one in spirit, I guess we would say. Overall, it was okay. It was okay. I mean, I'll give you kind of my more wrap-up overall review after we look at some clips, but I think Joe Biden sort of struck the right note and tone overall, and in particular with Ukraine, Russia. That was probably the strongest part, and he opened with that. There was a bunch in the middle that was very so-so, and a lot of kind of vague throwing out things he's going to do, which will obviously never see the light of day, with absolutely no explanation as to how some of those things would even be possible, and we will get to that. But overall, you have to remember, this is a particularly weaponized Republican Party whose goal is just stop Biden at any opportunity. Just don't let him do anything. And given that context, it is difficult to put together a speech that Republicans in any real way are going to be satisfied by. But let's just get right into it. Joe Biden opening up with a statement of solidarity with Ukraine.
6 days ago, Russia's Vladimir Putin sought to shake the very foundations of the free world, thinking he could make it bend to his menacing ways. But he badly miscalculated. He thought he could roll into Ukraine and the world would roll over. Instead, he met with a wall of strength he never anticipated or imagined. He met the Ukrainian people.
So the tone here was the right tone. And again, he started strong, and this was really one of the better parts of the speech, continuing on to talk about new restrictions, sanctions, limitations on Russia and Russian oligarchs. And again, also played very well with the crowd.
Tonight, I say to the Russian oligarchs and the corrupt leaders who built billions of dollars off this violent regime, no more. The United States... I mean it. The United States Department of Justice is assembling a dedicated task force to go after the crimes of the Russian oligarchs. We're joining with European allies to find and seize their yachts, their luxury apartments, their private jets. We're coming for your ill-begotten gains. And tonight, I'm announcing that we will join our allies in closing off American airspace to all Russian flights, further isolating Russia and adding additional squeeze on their economy.
So more restrictions, and those well received, and the restrictions make sense. The only caveat is we do want to make sure that all Americans that are in Russia can get home. Obviously, the signals to those in Ukraine for a while have been get out, but we want to make sure that Americans in Russia can get home. But all popular, sensible things to be doing. Again, Republicans basically clapping for just about everything Joe Biden said on the issue of Russia-Ukraine.
The United States and our allies will defend every inch of territory that is NATO territory with the full force of our collective power. Every single inch.
Okay, so that stuff, very strong and very popular with the entire crowd. And then it became a more typical State of the Union address. Republicans, for example, booing when Joe Biden correctly points out Donald Trump's tax cuts disproportionately benefited the rich. They did. And Republicans boo, either because they don't believe it or because they don't like that it's being pointed out.
Unlike the $2 trillion tax cut passed in the previous administration, that benefited the top 1% of Americans. The American Rescue Plan helped working people and left no one behind.
So a bit of a strange false start there from Chuck Schumer, but the Republicans booing Joe Biden's comment about who benefited from Donald Trump's tax cuts, although what Joe Biden said was perfectly accurate. At an almost immediately subsequent point, Joe Biden talks about what has been record job growth under the Biden administration. And of course, it is true. And we can flesh that out further by talking about this sort of unique COVID recovery period in which Joe Biden started his presidency. Needless to say, at one point, the camera points to Mitch McConnell, and McConnell looks like he had some bad clams before the event upon hearing about record job growth.
We created jobs, lots of jobs. In fact, our economy created over 6.5 million new jobs just last year. More jobs in 1 year than ever before in the history of the United States of America. The economy grew at a rate of 5.7 last year, the strongest growth rate in 40 years. And the first step in bringing fundamental change to our economy that hasn't worked for working people in this nation for too long. For the past 40 years.
And there's Mitch McConnell, who just looks like something was wrong with the muscles, if you know what I mean, at dinner beforehand. Then Joe Biden started getting into some of sort of the general policy ideas, and a lot of them made for okay rhetoric. But I'm going to be honest with you guys, a lot of these are basically impossibilities. Let's listen to the first one.
That means make more cars and semiconductors in America. More infrastructure and innovation in America. More goods moving faster and cheaper in America. More jobs where you can earn a good living in America. Instead of relying on foreign supply chains, let's make it in America. Look, economists.
So, I think this is one of those things where this is the epitome of the absurdity of American politics. Republicans who say they're all about build and buy American are mostly just sitting after Joe Biden says we're going to build and buy American. So first of all, I thought Republicans wanted that, and then all of a sudden they're sitting down and it's just political trash. At the same time, we have an economy based on not building American. And what I mean by that is decades ago, the decision was made implicitly. It's not that someone one day said, let's structure our entire economy on cheap stuff from China and other countries. Nobody said that. But through cumulative decisions about labor and about outsourcing and about trade, the collective implicit decision was made. We would rather pay less for stuff, but get it from places like China. And to do the build and buy American thing that Joe Biden is talking about, it would raise prices on those things in the United States. It would. And it would take at minimum 8 to 10 years to start making a lot of those changes. So I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm pointing out the absurdity of a president saying it's going to be great when we do this thing, which all of us over the last 40 years have decided not to do. We've actually done the opposite through our trade and other regulations and agreements. But also it's something Republicans claim to want, but they don't cheer when Joe Biden says it. It's like those 25 seconds are the epitome of everything that's sort of broken with American politics. Now, the most vile moment of the entire speech, and we will focus in on this more later, was when Joe Biden was talking about his son, Bo, who died of cancer, and Lauren Boebert yells out disgustingly.
You've been there. I've been in and out of Iraq and Afghanistan over 40 times. These burn pits that incinerate waste, the waste of war, medical and hazards material, jet fuel, and so much more. And they come home. Many of the world's fittest and best trained warriors in the world. Never the same. Headaches, numbness, dizziness. A cancer that would put them in a flag-draped coffin. I know. One of those soldiers was my son, Major.
Yeah, That was Lauren Boebert, and we're going to talk about that a little later. The most disgusting moment I ever remember from any State of the Union. Joe Biden then talking about corporations and the wealthy paying higher taxes, and Elizabeth Warren liked it.
Looking to punish anybody. But let's make corporations and wealthy Americans start paying their fair share. Look, last year.
So Elizabeth Warren liking that one understandably, then a sort of kind of like a muted, we've done pretty well and are ready to kind of start moving on from COVID. Not like the huge mission accomplished, but sort of one.
For more than 2 years, COVID has impacted every decision in our lives and the life of this nation. And I know you're tired, frustrated, and exhausted. That doesn't even count the close to 1 million people who sit at a dining room table or a kitchen table and look at an empty chair because they lost somebody. But I also know this, because of the progress we've made, because of your resilience and the tools that we have been provided by this Congress, tonight I can say we're moving forward safely back to more normal routines. We've reached a new moment in the fight against COVID-19.
So a sort of soft victory declaration, which I think is okay. It's what was expected, and it's basically warranted by the numbers that we are seeing. At another point, Joe Biden talking about the importance of funding police. We
all agree the answer is not to defund the police. That's right. It's to fund the police. Fund them.
So some on the left taking that as a direct attack on the progressive movement. But the truth is the majority of the progressive movement doesn't actually want to defund the police. We want to fix the police. And that's the reality. Lastly, Joe Biden again finishing strong on the topic of Ukraine and go get him. Go get him. The final line of the night.
I've come to report on the state of the nation, the state of the union. And my report is this. The State of the Union is strong because you, the American people, are strong. We are stronger today. We are stronger today than we were a year ago. And we'll be stronger a year from now than we are today. This is our moment to meet and overcome the challenges of our time. And we will, as one people, one America, the United States of America. God bless you all, and may God protect our troops. Thank you. Go get him.
Go get him, seemingly, apparently related to Vladimir Putin. So, okay, my honest rating, if I just say this is what it was, with normal standards, right? I mean, Trump really threw off our barometer, but with normal standards, this was probably a B. The opening Ukraine section was good. It was the right tone. The entire speech was probably the right tone and energy. There were endless disjointed transitions that were extraordinarily abrupt. A lot of very vague ideas thrown out. At one point, Joe Biden saying, we're going to crack down on people charging customers too much for things. Like, wait, are you suggesting price controls? Like that's a really big deal. What are you talking about? Are you proposing legislation? Absolutely no idea. And I understand it's a State of the Union. You don't lay out everything in detail, but there were so many of those things thrown out, which are obviously never going to see the light of day. So I would give it a B overall, with many elements that were what was needed given the situation in Ukraine and Russia, not made easier overall by the fact that the Republican Party has become a parody of itself. So that's my thought. Let's now talk about the most vile moment ever in a State of the Union address. Yesterday, during Joe Biden's first official State of the Union address, we saw the most vile, deplorable, disgusting moment that I've ever seen during any State of the Union. And it was the moment that radical Republican Congresswoman Lauren Boebert yelled out, 13 of them died on your watch, or something like that, when Joe Biden started talking about veterans who have died in the line of service. And that includes, by the way, his deceased son who died of cancer. And in the middle of this moment, Lauren Boebert yells out, and it is the most disgusting moment of any State of the Union I can remember.
You've been there. I've been in and out of Iraq and Afghanistan over 40 times. These burn pits that incinerate waste, the waste of war, medical and hazards material, jet fuel, and so much more. And they come home. Many of the world's fittest and best trained warriors in the world. Never the same. Headaches, numbness, dizziness. A cancer that would put them in a flag-draped coffin. I know. One of those soldiers was my son, Major Boebert. I don't know for sure if the burn pit that he lived near, that his hooch was near, in Iraq and earlier than that in Kosovo, is the cause of his brain cancer, the disease of so many other troops. But I am committed to find out everything we can.
These are the most disgusting, gross, bad people. These aren't just bad legislators. And there's some debate as to whether both of the outbursts were Boebert. One of them might have been Marjorie Taylor Greene. It's not, they're both gross. They both turned their backs on Biden when Biden walked in. I wouldn't want Boebert or Greene working at my local coffee shop, at my local library, teaching school kids, being a nurse if I go into a hospital. They are the types of gross, bad people that I don't want anywhere near me in any aspect of my life. And I mean, before this, the most kind of disrespectful State of the Union moment that I can recall is when Republican Congressman Joe Wilson yelled, "You lie," at Barack Obama. Let's review that.
There are also those who claim that our reform efforts would ensure illegal immigrants. This, too, is false. The reforms I'm proposing would not apply to those who are here illegally.
Wow. So that was considered disrespectful, and it was. It is nothing compared to Lauren Boebert yelling out when Joe Biden is literally talking about his son who died. Boebert tweeted about this, trying to make it seem like her morals wouldn't allow her to sit idly by, tweeting, "When Biden said flag-draped coffins, I couldn't stay silent. I told him directly he did it. He put 13 in there. Our heroic servicemen and women deserve so much better." In a different era, a congresswoman shouting and heckling the president at a State of the Union while he's talking about not just U.S. soldiers killed in action generally, but about his own deceased son would be universally condemned across the political spectrum, starting with her caucus leader, and might even be censured, punished in some way. But these people have support. The people who like Boebert and Greene, they see this. Just look online. Go, look at all the typical places. Look at the responses to their own tweets. And they celebrate them for doing this. These are vile, disgusting people. And if you don't think what they did is shameful, you should be ashamed of yourself. These are disgusting individuals who have no business doing anything involving public service. We're going to take a break. Find me at dpackman on Twitter. We'll be right back. One of our sponsors today is Cheese Butter, giving you 15% off. I love this stuff. Cheese Butter is a delicious gourmet cheese melt that ingeniously blends 4 indulgent cheeses and aromatically seasoned butter. All the ingredients, the cheese, the butter, the seasonings are sourced for the highest quality. You can really taste that this was made with fresh, simple, high shelf ingredients, nothing artificial. Cheese on bread, right? I mean, come on. And butter on bread. Why wouldn't I love Cheese Butter? Put it on French bread, sourdough, bagels, English muffin, Jewish rye, pumpernickel, sandwiches, grilled cheese, burgers, baked potatoes, mac and cheese, broccoli, veggies. Cheese Butter is a business that supports the David Pakman Show. Support them. Their product is really fantastic. It's been a secret recipe in their family for 50 years. Taste it for yourself to really understand what it's about. I don't think you'll be sorry. Cheese Butter is giving my audience 15% off when you go to cheesebutter.com/Pakman. Quite literally, as Joe Biden was giving his State of the Union address last night, more and more news continued to break, and incredible things were happening in Russia and Ukraine, and Russia's continued invasion, which, by all recent reports, continues to push towards Kyiv. And we're wondering when will the big attempt to take Kyiv take place, if at all? All signs point to it will at some point. And one of the pieces of the story that is just almost beyond belief is that an assassination attempt against the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, has been foiled. And it has allegedly been foiled, at least in part, thanks to some members of Russia's FSB, its intelligence service. And if this is as reported, and now there are widespread reports of it, it is unbelievable. Axios reporting, Zelensky assassination plot foiled, Ukrainian authorities say. Okay. Ukrainian National Security and Defense Council Chief Alexei Danilov announced during a briefing Tuesday that Ukrainian forces foiled an assassination plot against Zelensky, according to a Telegram post from Ukrainian authorities. The big picture. According to the Telegram message, Danilov said that a unit of elite Chechen special forces known as Kadyrovites had been behind the plot and were subsequently eliminated. Okay. We are well aware of the special operation that was to take place directly by the Kadyrovites to eliminate our president. Ukrainian authorities had been tipped off about the plot by members of Russia's Federal Security Service who don't support the war. Danilov elaborated that the Kadyrovite group had been divided into two, with one being destroyed in Gostomel and the other under fire. This story, if true as told, is truly incredible. I mean, we know that many Russians don't support the invasion of Ukraine that Vladimir Putin is carrying out. We know that, and many of them, thousands have been protesting, hundreds have been arrested. We know that. But what this story, if true, points to is that even deep in the upper echelons, or at least in some of the top organizations like the security service, the FSB, there are not only dissenting voices, but voices that are not just neutrally dissenting, like I'm not going to say anything, but I don't like this, but they became aware of an assassination plot against President Zelensky, and they made sure that it was known by Ukrainian authorities and security officials so that it could be foiled, and apparently it was. The other aspect of this, of course, is, we talked about the very strange pictures, many of them now, of Vladimir Putin sitting at tables with his advisors, and the table is 50 feet long. It reminds me of, the old Batman movie? It's one of the first movies I saw when I moved to the U.S. with Jack Nicholson and Michael Keaton. There's a scene where Bruce Wayne takes, I believe it's the Kim Basinger character, home to his house, and they're in this extremely cold dining room, and Bruce Wayne says, I don't even know that I've been in this room before. And the table is crazy long, and they end up sitting next to each other because the table's so absurdly long. The tables Putin is sitting at are even longer. And one of the things we hypothesized was, could he be worried that even inside the top brass, his top advisors, there could be people who want to see him dead? And that's the reason for the separation, not COVID or whatever else might be. Maybe it is. And if the FSB foiling the plot story is true, it would make perfect sense that would be something Vladimir Putin is afraid of. An incredible story. Also interesting yesterday, CNN was able to get an interview with President Zelensky in his bunker. He's been in a bunker for some period of time and occasionally exiting the bunker to record videos and do different things that we have seen. CNN's Matthew Chan spoke with Zelensky in the bunker about what's going on with negotiations and other things, and it is incredible to see.
You sent your delegation to meet the Russians for talks. Yeah. Did anything substantial come out of that? Is there any hope, as the world watches, for diplomacy?
They decided to begin to speak about this situation. And I really wanted, and I asked them, so you have to speak, first of all, everybody has to stop fighting and to go to that point from where it was beginning. Yeah. Yes, it began 6 days ago. Yes. I think there are principal things you can do it, and that is very important moment. If you do this, and if those side is ready, it means that they are ready for the peace.
The level of I've never been like a big Zelensky fan or anything like it, but the level of poise that he is exhibiting from a bunker, separated from his family, as bombs are dropping, shelling is happening all over the country, it is just incredible.
If they don't ready, it means that you're just, wasting time.
And do you think you're wasting your time, or do you think they're ready?
We'll see.
Just, I mean, it is unbelievable what is taking place right now. And the question around the so-called negotiations is an important question. We sort of just very casually talked about, well, what is it Russia would want in such negotiations? I imagine Russia would want to officially kind of see Ukraine give up on Crimea and probably give up on the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. That's probably something Russia would want. Is that something Ukraine would be willing to give? It's hard to imagine. On the other hand, I would imagine that Ukraine would want Russia to accept that if Ukraine joins NATO or if Ukraine joins the EU, it would not be opposed by Russia or seen as a sign of aggression or as a justification for aggression by Russia. And it's very hard to imagine that that's something that Russia would accept as well. So they talk about negotiations. It's, in a practical sense, very difficult to imagine what sort of agreement there could be that would be satisfactory to both sides. But that's why there's such a thing as professional diplomacy and professional negotiators. We will continue seeing that. There's sort of the two tracks. There's we are looking at doing some negotiation on the border with Belarus, and there's, at some point, Putin's going to make his play for Kyiv, and that could be at any time. And it's not obvious that Ukrainian forces and volunteers are going to be able to repel the Russian forces. So the next 24, 48 hours could be key. We're going to take a quick break. The clips from that Zelensky interview, which is very much worth watching, will be on our Instagram, which you can find at David Pakman Show. Don't forget that the best way to support the David Pakman Show is by becoming a member, which gives you access to the daily bonus show, the regular show with no commercials. You also get access to our entire archive of every episode dating back a really long time, and plenty of other awesome membership perks. Go to joinpakman.com and use the coupon code BETTER21 for a huge discount. Joinpakman.com. Today, we're going to be speaking with Heath Druzin, who's creator and host of the podcast Extremely American, produced in partnership with Post-Industrial Media and Boise State Public Radio. You can find Extremely American everywhere you get podcasts. Heath, it's really great having you on today. I appreciate it.
Great to be here. Thanks.
So, certainly since the Trump riots and even before that, we've been covering militia groups, so-called militia groups, for a long period of time. You covered the Pennsylvania Volunteer Militia, which is sort of adjacent to some of the other groups maybe people in my audience are familiar with. Can you talk a little bit about how'd you get interested in this? How'd you start covering them? What are some of their views? How would we characterize these groups?
Yeah, I mean, I've been covering the militia movement and kind of the broader far right movement for a number of years now. What kind of got me started on this podcast is I started seeing them get a lot more politically active, kind of come out of the woods, come out of the mountains, and be much more visible in everyday life. The Pennsylvania Volunteers, they are an interesting group because they're led by a guy named Christian Yingling. And he played a pretty notable role in Charlottesville in 2017. And your listeners probably recognize that. That was the white supremacist rally in Charlottesville that also drew in a lot of militia groups who said they were there to basically keep the peace between right-wing protesters and left-wing counter-protesters. Some people question that. So Yingling was there. He actually got sued and agreed to never come back to Charlottesville with a militia. So he's been in the news. He's a very sort of colorful character. So I got to know him through that. And I had been doing a number of interviews with him and trying to get in on his training because I wanted to give listeners of my podcast, Extremely American, I wanted to give them a real feel for what it's like to be at a training with a militia, what they do, get there on the gun range with them. So that's what brought me out there. It took me a while to get their trust, but they eventually let me come to their monthly training, which was deep in the Pennsylvania woods, kind of out in these rolling mountains in Western Pennsylvania, the sort of classic site you would imagine a militia training happening at.
Yeah.
So that's what got me there.
And, we've spoken to people who have, I don't want to use the term infiltrated, but who have been sort of like granted access to different types of extremists, and different journalists and reporters take different approaches in terms of whether they just remain extraordinarily neutral in terms of their opinion of what it is that they're observing, or whether they are sort of engaged in conversations about their views as to what these groups do. What's the dynamic like when you're with these folks in terms of how they see you and sort of what the conversations are like?
Yeah, I mean, so if you listen to the podcast, especially episode 1 with this group, what you'll hear is I let them tell their own story. But, I don't just sit on the sidelines. If somebody says something outlandish, I challenge them.
Yeah.
So I'll give you an example. Christian Yingling, at one point, he's talking about he went to a Trump rally where there were counter protesters, and he was standing with his guys between the left and right wing protesters. Well, he talks about the story about how he was basically trying to get the left wing protesters to back up. Now, they're in a public park, right? He has no authority there. He's a private citizen. And he's telling them to back up, and he's telling them basically, if you don't back up, I'm going to break your leg to one of the guys. And that's where I do step in, and I'm like, well, now hold on, under whose authority do you do that? And so there's back and forths like that. I do want to let them tell their own story because I think that's more interesting for a listener than me just spouting off. But certainly, I'm not going to let something like that just sort of twist in the wind. So there's some kind of fun back and forth about that. About January 6th, about Donald Trump. So yeah, I'll challenge people when I feel like that is appropriate. But I do also want people to hear their viewpoint, because I think understanding these groups is much more important than slamming them, for example, just to sort of feel good.
At the individual level, I've spoken to a lot of former hate group members, including KKK and some other groups. And the one theme that is present in all of their stories was they were sucked in because of a sort of personal vulnerability of their situation that came often from sort of like the prototypical absent or broken family or lack of direction from parents. It's like a very similar story that they all tell. Is that a common backstory in the folks that you see in the militia groups, or is that different?
So I would say there's a little bit of yes and no there. I've certainly met people who fit that mold. I think with militia groups, though, because most of them they're not explicitly racist, and a lot of them actually will at least outwardly reject that. I think they have a bit of broader appeal. I think when you're talking about like explicitly white supremacist groups, I think that recruitment's a little tougher, and you really have to try harder. With the militia groups, they try to have a bigger tent, I guess you can say. So what I do find, though, is people who are very disaffected with what's happening in America. They might be uncomfortable with a changing country. They might be uncomfortable with increasing diversity. They may not say it like that, but they will talk about certain things like transgender rights come up a lot, and that makes a lot of people in this movement uncomfortable. They'll talk about critical race theory. Now, whether or not that's actually a real thing in American schools, that's obviously something that people are debating. But there is a discomfort with a changing America that draws people in. And I think certainly Donald Trump's rise to power and some of the things he said made them feel more empowered than they have, and I think made them feel more comfortable coming out in the open as opposed to just training out in the woods.
Is there a notable undertone of anti-Semitism in these groups?
I would actually say no. I am a Jewish reporter. I did not feel that directly. I did speak to one very prominent Jewish member of the 3% militia in Washington State. He figures prominently in episode 3, and we talk a little bit about his background. Now, is that to say that there is not a strain of anti-Semitism? No. I also ran into some really offensive stuff where people would they would compare COVID protocols to Nazism. Now, is that directly anti-Semitism? We can debate that, but it's certainly very offensive, I think, to a lot of people. So I would say explicitly, no. You do get that undercurrent with some people, and I think you do get some sort of explaining away of stuff.
How prominent is the presence of law enforcement current or former and military current and former in your experience in these groups?
I run into a lot of ex-military in these groups. I also run into a lot of people who kind of are in the, I wish I would have served kind of mold. But you do run into a lot of veterans. You run into some law enforcement. It gets kind of murky. There's certainly some law enforcement that have been supportive. There's a whole sheriff's movement called the Constitutional Sheriff's Movement, and they have elected sheriffs all over the country. Joe Arpaio in Arizona was part of that, and they're very friendly to militias. Now, you also get law enforcement who are dead set against them because they see their anti-government rhetoric as also anti-law enforcement. So it's a very mixed bag. But I would say the veteran part of it, that is a robust part of the the militia movement.
Do the militia groups get along with each other, or do they see each other as competitors, or they believe they aren't, do they have problems with the ideologies of some of the other groups?
So that's a great question. This might not be surprising, but anti-government movements are not very good at centralized control. So there is a lot of bickering back and forth and a lot of infighting. And frankly, just some honest disagreements where you'll have groups that absolutely will disavow another group, including different 3% groups. There's a group in Georgia that has a Confederate flag in their logo, and some of the other 3%ers in the West, they'll look to them and say, we absolutely want nothing to do with those guys. They're racist and we reject them. So it's a mixed bag. They do come together over two things: a radical view of limited government and pretty much absolutist gun rights. Any restriction on gun rights they see as a red line. I would say almost every militia group agrees on those two things.
What is the, or let's see how I can phrase this. There's the fear among observers of some of these groups that at some point they're going to do like their big thing, like you think about Jim Jones in Jonestown, and eventually there was like the mass suicide of the 950 people in South America, and it was sort of like the culmination of the entire thing. And there's the fear that some equivalent, not killing themselves necessarily, but there's the equivalent that they're building to some kind of big event. Do you get the sense that that's the eventual goal, or are they there more of as a constant low grade protection against, as they see it, against the tyranny and oppression of the government, or whatever the case may be, without planning like some big event?
I think what you're seeing is, and what I get into in Extremely American, is this shift away from that kind of thinking more to, hey, we have this moment where we've got more mainstream support. Let's try to change government from the inside. There's a lot of younger leaders who I would say are much more politically savvy than the old guard from the Michigan militia and those kind of groups. And, they're targeting their local school boards, their library boards. They're picking off state Senate and state legislature seats. So that's not to say we couldn't have that. I mean, we've seen it at least twice. We saw Cliven Bundy's ranch where all those militia guys were pointing weapons at federal agents. Right. That could have gone quickly. And we saw it in Oregon where Ammon Bundy, Cliven's son, had an armed standoff of his own. Now, we could totally see that again. I think a lot of these guys are much more focused on trying to bring government to the right as opposed to, having an armed confrontation, even though when you ask them, they will admit they are simultaneously training to fight against the government and kind of trying to be a part of it.
Yeah, well, so that was going to be my next thing, which is you talked about the presence of military veterans. There's in hypothetical discussions about what might happen if one of these groups really tried something big, there's the reality that eventually they might be confronting not just police, but if they really wreaked enough havoc, the National Guard, or they would sort of be against the military, but they are made up. They have a significant former military presence. How do they conceive of that, of the idea that ultimately the force that might stop them is the one that many of them were once a part of?
Right. And that's something you can't escape. When I talk to militia members and leaders about that, often they kind of deflect at first. But when I press them, they admit, yes, I mean, that you can't talk about fighting the government without the possibility and really the almost probability, if you fight the government, that your guns are going to be pointed at law enforcement and or troops. Now, what they'll say if you press them is that, you know, righteous troops and law enforcement will step aside because the battle will be righteous for the militia guys. Right. But it's absolutely something that hangs in the background and you can't avoid it. And when you look at those standoffs, they were against law enforcement and they weren't against troops, but they were against law enforcement. And in the case of the Oregon standoff, you know, there was a deadly shootout and a man got killed. So it's not theoretical. That could happen, and it has happened.
In terms of the political alignment, when it comes to Democrats, Republicans, et cetera, I mean, you made it clear they want to move the government to the right. Their most important issues certainly align more with the Republican Party than the Democratic Party. But like, is there any political diversity within these groups?
Yeah, and I also get into that in the podcast because I think the political angle on these groups, it makes them so much more interesting now. I mean, I should say yes and no. Are any of them Democrats that I've met? No. Do they have diverse political views? Yeah. There is a diversity of views. Some are more libertarian, sort of live and let live. Some of them are really much more sort of fundamentalist, far right groups. And I would say more of them are of that ilk. And that's why they're targeting school boards. They talk a lot about critical race theory and culture war issues. And I think that's a big change from the 1990s. In the 1990s, they might have been very conservative, but they were very much pox on both parties. They're all the same. These guys today, they're much more involved in Republican politics. And I think that's a really important shift because they've sort of picked sides in a way that they didn't in the past. They just saw all government as bad before.
Right. That's interesting. And there's also the question as to how responsible Donald Trump is for that, and whether the political activism may fade to some degree if Trumpism fades. I mean, that's a question we've had about the general voter who never voted before Trump, was pulled in to vote for Trump. And then now it's unclear how engaged they stay, right?
Yeah, and I think that's the one of the biggest questions hanging over this movement. Now, I think they were on the rise before Trump. I saw them rising before Trump. But they were supercharged by Trump. They saw somebody at the highest echelon of power. Really, they saw him as supportive. Now, they talk a lot about basically taking that momentum and continuing that kind of Trumpism without Trump. I think we're going to see. I think that's a real open question. I think these midterm elections might have a lot to do with it. But they're trying to keep that momentum up right now. And I do think we'll see if Trump jumps back in 2024. But without him, they do potentially lose momentum. But I guess we'll just have to see how far right the right wing of American politics has gone.
Without a doubt. Yeah, no, it's without a doubt an open question that we're all sort of anxiously waiting to start getting some answers to. The podcast is Extremely American. Creator and host of the podcast, Heath Druzin, has been talking to us about his investigative work. Heath, really appreciate your time today.
Thanks so much. I appreciate you having me on.
If you value what we do at The David Pakman Show, remember to support us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/David Pakman Show, where you can get access to behind-the-scenes videos, the daily bonus show, the commercial-free daily show, as well as special discounts on merch, including hats, hoodies, mugs, and t-shirts. You can support the show for as little as $2 a month. Check it out at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. One of the things many of you have been writing to me and asking over the last couple of weeks of the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been some version of, hey, David, why do so many American right-wingers love Vladimir Putin? And this is not a topic that has slipped the minds of many on the left who have been wondering and asking about it. There's actually a couple of good articles that you guys can check out. One such article by Arwa Madawi is an opinion piece in The Guardian called "Why Does Putin Have Superfans Among the U.S. Right Wing?" The subheadline being, the Russian leader is an autocrat with a homophobic and misogynistic worldview. No wonder he's admired by so many Republicans, pointing to essentially the governing and cultural similarities between Putin and what many right-wingers would like to see. Robert Reich wrote in The Guardian an opinion piece called "Putinism is breeding in the heart of the Republican Party. Make no mistake, Putin's authoritarian neo-fascism has rooted itself in America. The Cold War has already come home." There are different reasons why different right-wingers find Putin to be an appealing and interesting figure. We saw the video, which I'm not going to play again, from the weekend at AFPAC. AFPAC was the openly white nationalist counterpart to CPAC. And at AFPAC, one of their leaders, Nick Fuentes, talked about Russia has going for it is young white men. And they started chanting Putin, Putin, Putin. And so for some people, what they like about Putin is white, homophobic, Trumpian reactionary, probably anti-Semitic to some degree, leader. And Putin anti-NATO and Trump anti-NATO up until 2 days ago. Remember that 2 days, I mean, this is so stupid, but 2 days ago, Trump started taking credit for NATO. Now that NATO is seen as good because it's on the side of Ukraine. Now Trump, after trying to crush NATO when he was president, now Trump says NATO's good. But up until before 2 days ago, Donald Trump and Putin both very much anti-NATO. And when you step back, Russia is sort of what many of these Republicans would like to see the United States become. And what I mean by that is they like the idea of the authoritarian strongman gets to decide who's president. I mean, that's what Putin essentially does. And it's what Trump tried to do. So that's very appealing to many Trump Republicans. Barely any serious worker protections in Russia, barely any environmental protections in Russia. The rich can get away with paying barely any taxes through their cronyistic connections to leadership. The government just openly tells media what to do, and they have a massive state media apparatus that does their bidding. Trumpists and Trump love that stuff. Open homophobia and other phobias that in the United States, at least to some degree, you're still kind of looked at as that's not really appropriate if you just come out and say a lot of the stuff. A lot of sort of state assets that are privatized, controlled by oligarchs, and people get cushy contracts because they're close to government. Yeah, all that type of corruption and cultural reactionary infrastructure that the United States doesn't fully have, that many Republicans would like to see it have, exists in Russia. It exists in Russia. You can even kind of make it even simpler. Change would be bad, and keeping right-wing white people in control is good. I mean, that's like, you could even simplify it even more, and you quickly understand why there are so many right-wingers who love what is happening in Russia. I think one other thing that's important to mention is that not everybody in the Trumpian Republican Party openly supports Putin. A lot of them don't, but they'll kind of talk around the edges about making sure that democracy works as intended, which, remember, is the same type of code that the Putin people use in Russia to justify their subjugation of democracy to control elections. it's really, really similar if you look at the language and you look at the goals and you look at the political orientation. So it's a serious topic. It's not just, a lot of these Trumpists are enamored with Putin. Yeah, some of them are, some of them not so openly, but the degree to which Russia is the image of what we would get here if the Trumpists got their way, whether or not they say positive things about Putin, should really scare all of us. Mitch McConnell is the Senate Minority Leader. He is a pretty horrible guy. Yesterday, during Joe Biden's State of the Union, when Joe Biden talked about his job creation record, McConnell didn't seem to like it. He just looked comatose, almost like he had some bad oysters before the event. He was given the opportunity yesterday to actually condemn what Donald Trump said about Vladimir Putin, calling the invasion of Ukraine genius and calling the invasion smart. And he didn't do it. McConnell's very willing to say Putin's bad, but he won't condemn Trump for what he said.
Leader McConnell, you've long been critical of President Vladimir Putin. Was it a mistake for the former president to praise Putin as very savvy, smart, and his Ukraine strategy is genius?
What President Putin is a ruthless thug who's just invaded another sovereign country and killed thousands of innocent people. That's what President Putin is.
So, yeah, McConnell sounds very, very sick. But what he's saying is, I'm not going to say anything about Donald Trump. When Donald Trump said Putin's savvy, genius, smart for what he did, Putin's bad, but I'm not going to condemn Trump. And I almost at this point wonder why, because Trump regularly attacks Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell did appear on Fox yesterday and blamed Joe Biden for what's happening in Ukraine, which is another popular one among the right.
Speech tonight. He goes into the chamber this evening with a 37% approval number. What do you think he needs to do tonight in order to galvanize the United States and to, as you said earlier, make a big course correction? What did you mean by that?
Well, look, he's in this kind of shape because he deserves to be in this kind of shape. Raging inflation, uncontrolled border. In my view, too late to deter Putin. Had we taken some of these steps earlier, this might not have happened. And the president's in a tough position because he deserves to be in a tough position.
Now understand that you really can't win with these people, because if Joe Biden and remember, it's not just the U.S., but if Joe Biden and other European allies had started the sanctions and the flight closures and these things early, these are the Republicans who under Trump were saying we should be getting along with Putin. There's no reason for unnecessary or extraordinary hostilities with Putin. So it's a no-win, because if Biden had started these moves earlier, he would have been criticized for doing too much too quickly and being overly aggressive. Now he's being criticized for not moving quickly enough. And these are just bad faith actors. That's the reality. I don't believe Joe Biden's response has been perfect, and I've criticized the response where I felt that it needs criticism. But these are just bad faith critiques. Now, just for comparison, again, I don't love the guy, but just as a comparison for a different type of Republican, here was Mitt Romney asked about Biden's handling, and he gives a much more normal response about Biden has done some things well. It's not Biden's fault that Putin invaded another country, but you could do better. This is like a more normal Republican response.
I just want to go back in time a little bit, Senator. Do you think it was a mistake for President Biden to rule out U.S. troops on the ground instead of trying to use what's known as strategic ambiguity to deter Vladimir Putin from invading in the first place?
Well, there really wouldn't have been an ambiguity. We don't have the kind of troop strength and material of war in the region to be a serious threat at that point. Look, the Biden administration has done some things very well and some things not so well. The not so well side is they continued the policy of prior administrations not to provide the defensive weapons that Ukraine needed. That was the mistake. The positive thing was sharing our intelligence with our allies and combining our efforts with our allies. Look, we used to be 40% of the world economy. Today, we're about half of that. And so for us to have the kind of economic clout we used to have back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, we really do need to combine with our allies. And that's something President Biden has done extraordinarily well.
So understand that That's sort of like, I know it's weird to hear that. Like to some people that might be like, well, that if you didn't know who it was, you'd be like, that must be a Democrat. No Republican would say that Joe Biden is actually doing things that well. There was a point at which more normal Republicans would say, oh, okay, hey, you know what? Your criticism of Biden isn't a good one, and here's why. And Mitt Romney explained that. On some things, Joe Biden has done a really good job. And here are the things I would have done differently. That at one point was actually normal. And for all of our disagreements with Mitt Romney, if Romney was the worst of the Republican Party, this country would be far better off than we are with people like McConnell, Boebert, Green, Cawthorn, Gohmert, and all of these, Gates and all of these other lunatics. So it would be great if we could go back in that direction. Republicans aren't incentivized to do that. And case in point, someone like Mitt Romney is not a celebrity Republican in the sense that the ones that get attention are the radical crazies, the ones that are willing to do things like Josh Hawley did on January 6, 2021, people like Ted Cruz, etc. It's the cartoons. And listen, I'm not giving the Republican Party advice. The country would be better off if Romney was the worst of the party. Sadly, Romney's the best of the party, not the worst of the party. We have a voicemail number, and that number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's a caller who says I was wrong about something. I think they're wrong. Let's take a listen.
David, you made a mistake on your show the day. You said that rents would go up because everything else is going up. But I own a house, and my mortgage does not go up just because everything else is going up. I'm still paying the same amount for my mortgage.
Yeah.
Now, if I went to go get a new mortgage, that would be another thing. But mortgages don't go up just because everything else goes up.
Okay. So first of all, if you have an adjustable rate mortgage, if rates go up, then your mortgage will go up. But the caller is confused. The point I made and that we talked about is when home prices go up, and the way you see home prices go up is they sell for more. I'm talking about transactions. When you start seeing houses and apartment buildings transact for more money, those increased sale prices are then reflected in rents. I know that if you already own a house, then the fact that other houses that are being sold sell for more doesn't affect your mortgage. But the point was, we would expect that when home sale prices go up, and this is the homes that are being sold, not you just living in your house, sir. When home prices go up, then you see rents reflect those increased sale prices with higher rents. That was the point. I wasn't wrong. We don't need to issue a correction. I would be right here issuing one if I needed to. Okay, on the bonus show today, more Western companies are severing ties with Russia. We'll tell you which ones. The Major League Baseball season is already delayed, and we'll talk about the labor dispute that's going on. And we will talk about primary results from Texas, where, yes, Beto O'Rourke won the Democratic gubernatorial primary. Incumbent Greg Abbott won the Republican gubernatorial primary. We'll talk about what that race is shaping up to be and much more on today's bonus show. Sign up at joinpacman.com, and we will see you then. Thanks a lot for watching today's show. I just want to take a second to tell you about today's sponsors. Cheese Butter is the delicious gourmet cheese melt that blends 4 indulgent cheeses and seasoned butter. I love this stuff. Perfect on bread, bagels, sandwiches, veggies, and more. You'll get 15% off at cheesebutter.com/Pacman. The link is down below.